All right, good afternoon. Good afternoon again, and thank you all for coming. Thank you for being here. We're in the middle, right in the middle of our semester-long speaker series on law and the production of inequality, and I think it's going to be a very interesting session. We have two very interesting speakers. I want to say a word about the next two speakers we have coming. On November 12th, we'll have Professor Tommaso Ferrando, I don't think he's Brazilian. He's actually Italian. So Tommaso Ferrando from the University of Bristol, who will be here to talk about law and the reproduction of food poverty. So you'll talk about sort of the legal regime around food and propose some potentially utopic ideas about how we should manage food and food scarcity around the world. I think that's also going to be an interesting presentation. And then our last speaker of the semester will be on November 28th, Professor Hila Shamir of Tel Aviv University, who will come to talk about feminist approaches to the regulation of sex work and how the criminalization and the regulation of sex work produces inequality in that space. So again, two more speakers over the course of the semester, two more interesting interventions, and I hope some of you can come back for those. Today, though, we're very pleased to have Mike Albertus from the University of Chicago from political science. His main research focus is on the political conditions under which governments implement egalitarian reforms. He had a first book on the politics of land reform called Autocracy and Redistribution, the Politics of Land Reform, showing how and why land reform programs are implemented. This one won the 2016 Lubert Award for Best Book Published in Comparative Politics in 2014 or 15. He's also interested in political regime transitions and stability, politics under dictatorship, clientelism, and civil conflict. He has a long-standing interest in the politics of redistribution and inequality. He's published in the American Journal of Political Science, British Journal of Political Science, Comparative Political Studies, International Studies Quarterly, Journal of Conflict Resolution, Comparative Politics, Economics and Politics, World Politics, lots of places. All the leading journals in political science. He has his undergraduate degree is in both political science and electrical engineering and in math from the University of Michigan, and he has a PhD in political science from Stanford University. So I will also introduce at this point our discussant for today, who's also actually a real treat to have. Olajumoke Yacob-Haliso is an associate professor of political science at Babcock University in Nigeria. She's our visiting professor, practitioner at the Center for Human Rights. We have this program where we invite people to come for a couple weeks to share their expertise and their knowledge with our faculty and our students, and to spend some time here getting to know us. So if any of you are faculty, and if any of you have people that you know who are abroad or elsewhere who would sort of be interesting to have around as part of our community of scholars, let us know. There will be another round of applications coming soon. In any event, she's here visiting us, and she's very graciously agreed to be our discussant. Her research has explored the positions of women in conflict and post-conflict situations in Africa, with a particular focus on refugee and displacement concerns. She's conducted extensive fieldwork in Liberia and some in Nigeria and also in Geneva. She has looked at broad issues in relation to the comparative politics of African states and won a number of research grants and fellowships, including from the American Council of Learned Societies, the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation, the African Studies Association Presidential Fellowship, and the UN University for Peace Africa program, among others. She is co-editor of 4 books, including Gendering Knowledge in Africa, in the African Diaspora, Contesting History and Power, and Africa's Big Men, Predatory State-Society Relations in Africa. She is acting dean of the Veronica Adeleke School of Social Sciences at Babcock University, and she holds a PhD in political science from the University of Ibadan, Nigeria. So normally, we try to have an interdisciplinary conversation, and this time we're making an exception because we think it will be a really interesting conversation among political scientists, but hopefully some of you will add the interdisciplinarity in any event. So join me in welcoming both Mike Albertus and Ola Yacob-Haliso to our speaker series.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me here, Dan. It's great to be here, and so I'm gonna present for a bit, and then there will be a discussant. And if anybody has questions, feel free. And if anyone wants to needs to tap out at some point, a kind of blood sugar, and wants to head for the food, if it comes in like 3 minutes from now, let me know, because I don't want to stand in the way for too long. So today I'm going to be talking about themes tied to inequality, democracy, and constitutionalism, and this is kind of where we're going for the day. So I'll talk a little bit about existing patterns of inequality in the world. I'll talk about why inequality matters a bit as well. I'm going to discuss major explanations for how it is that we understand existing patterns of inequality. And then I'm going to move into talking a little bit about the role of democracy and democratic transition. So how processes of democratization impact inequality, how elites play a role in those processes, and how they impact inequality under democracy. And then I'll talk about sort of constitutions as a particular and a relatively prevalent tool in that, a tool sort of in the quiver of elites in the context of transitions to democracy in ways, a tool that can be used to safeguard their interests under democracy. Okay, so this is, to get started, this is a map here of the Gini coefficient of income inequality across the world, circa, I believe, 2009. And the Gini coefficient, for those of you who are unfamiliar, ranges, say, from 0 to 1, where 0 is perfect equality and 1 is perfect inequality, in which one individual earns all the income in a society. The greener colors, bluish green colors, are sort of greater equality. Yellow are countries coded in yellow are those that are sort of middling levels of inequality. And then those that are colored, in pink and purple, are countries that have really high levels of inequality. There are some that are grayed, countries for which we don't have data on inequality. What you can see is that there's quite there's a wide world of inequality out there, right? There's a lot of variation across the world. Latin America, certain parts of sub-Saharan Africa, Papua New Guinea, Malaysia, countries that have really high levels of inequality, particularly high. Particularly low would be countries in Eastern Europe, Northern Europe, for example, right? That's a static picture of inequality. There's in the dynamic picture of inequality, there's a general trend, particularly in the developed world and the industrialized world, of greater increasing inequality over time. That's particularly true since the 1970s. So if you take a look at the Gini coefficient in the United States since 1910, what you see is that it sort of increased through the 1920s. It plummeted during the Great Depression, stayed relatively low around the time of World War II and in the post-war period, and then around 1970 it really started to take off again. And that most of that is driven, if you look at income accruing to different percentiles of the distribution of within the population of income, most of that story is driven by the rise of the 1% and the 0.1%. That's not unique to the United States. Like I said, a lot of industrialized countries, this is data from Piketty's recent book, the capital income ratio here since 1970 has essentially been increasing in a relatively secular manner across many industrialized countries. There's a general trend, right? So why should we care, right? Why should we care about inequality? Well, there's a lot of research that suggests that inequality has various pernicious effects on economic mobility, on crime, on political influence, and even on citizens' happiness. So this is some data simply from the United States that suggests that inequality harms economic mobility. And so this is a graph that shows the likelihood that at, say, age 30 or age 40, an individual born between 1940 or 1985 is going to earn more than their parents, right, at that particular age, right? So what you can see is that, if you're born in 1980 or 1940, I should say, by the time that you're 30, you have a very high likelihood of earning more than your parents did, right? If you're born in 1985, if you're a millennial, you've got about a coin flip's probability of earning more than your parents did at age 30. And so that's a big difference, right? And that has sort of, worked in that trend has sort of occurred in tandem with this rise in inequality. There's also data at the local level from the United States here. This is the county level. This is county level data on household income inequality, where counties that are colored in darker red are more unequal. Those are lighter are more equal. And this is the graph on the right that shows the likelihood from rising from sort of the bottom quintile of the income distribution to the top within your lifetime. And what you see again is there's certainly a correlation between the two, right? So you're much less likely to rise from the bottom to the top in counties that are more unequal in the United States. There are data, albeit not very good data, on how inequality links to crime rates, and there's some research that suggests that inequality is in fact tied to higher crime rates, higher robbery and homicide rates. This is data across the world. It's cross-country data. This is data within the United States by different cities. So again, there's a positive relationship between those. Okay. There's also evidence that inequality distorts representation. So there is recent work by Larry Bartels that suggests that senators' responsiveness to their constituencies depends on, or I should say that the correspondence between high, medium, and low income citizens corresponds to very different levels to the express partisanship of their representatives, as represented here by W nominate scores, which are basically scores of a legislator's sort of partisanship, right, on the basis of bills and things that they vote on. What they find is that there's a high sort of ideological correspondence between high-income voters and the voting patterns of their Congress people. There's a very low relationship, or a null relationship, perhaps even a negative relationship, between the partisan preferences of low-income citizens and the expressed sort of ideology scores of their representatives. There's also data that suggests that this actually maps onto actual policy that's implemented as well, right? So, when the relatively wealthy in a particular area support a particular, policy favored by their legislators, it's much more likely to actually become law than when they do not favor such a policy, right? And that's not true of lower and middle income voters. Finally, there's some data that suggests that inequality is linked to unhappiness. So there's a negative relationship between income inequality and how individuals sort of evaluate themselves on a life kind of happiness score. This is again at the international level. And people also report having more negative experiences in life as income inequality rises, right? So there's reasons to believe that income inequality really has these actual concrete consequences, right? All right, so then the question becomes, why are some countries more unequal than others? And so there are a lot of different explanations, or there are several explanations, let's say a handful, there's probably more out there, but these are kind of the main explanations for why some countries are much more equal than others. So the first is tied to initial geographic endowments and incentives at the time of colonization for countries that are colonized, which ends up being most countries of the world, right? Second, relative, how homogeneous or heterogeneous your society is in racial or ethnic terms. The third has to do with war involvement and mobilization for conflict. The fourth has to do with capitalism per se. And the last has to do with democracy and regime type. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that after I step through a couple of these other explanations. Okay, so the first one has to do with geographic endowments. And so, an example of this comes from the Americas. And so the argument in the context of the Americas is that where crops and soils exhibited economies of scale and climates were unfavorable for European settlement, this is particularly true in say, the Caribbean, southern United States, northern Brazil. In those places, colonizers set up unequal systems that concentrated political and economic power amongst a few white colonizer slave owners. And in contrast to that, smallholder societies, say the northern United States, parts of Argentina and Uruguay, had greater political and economic inequality at the time of colonization, right? And that had long-term consequences. So early, more egalitarian societies created better institutions, more representative institutions that protected property, and that ultimately later on were better advantaged or better poised to take advantage of industrialization by encouraging, for example, safe investment, by encouraging private property rights, whereas slave societies with exclusionary political and economic institutions ended up stagnating at the time when a lot of the, of Europe and northern North America was industrializing. So again, these initial conditions had long lingering effects. Government policies and institutions tended to reproduce over time the fundamental characteristics of early New World economies. And there are a whole host of mechanisms of why this persisted over time, why there was relative persistence in this, in egalitarianism or inegalitarianism over time within the Americas, tied to things like voting rules, control over resources, control over who got access to education and how. There were very modest commitments to public investments like schooling in more exclusionary political systems and economies. In those places also, elites tended to keep taxes low. They kept competition in labor markets for individuals from good backgrounds relatively limited. They concentrated land holding in the hands of a relatively few people, and they funded government not through direct sort of taxation of income and wealth, but rather through indirect sorts of mechanisms, things like tariffs, customs, excise taxes, and the like. And so this is true, across the Americas, but it's also true, within the geographic variation of modern-day countries that were settled with different types of initial geographic endowments, like the United States, right? So if you look at the relationship between property tax as a proportion of total tax, it's negatively related to the Gini coefficient within states in the United States. This is data from 1980. So there's long-standing persistence in these forms of taxation and forms of representation. There's another argument that suggests that, ethnic or racial homogeneity within a society is more conducive to greater equality. And that's because individuals, and there's experimental data on this, that suggests that individuals are more likely to be generous in supporting redistribution to others who are like themselves, for reasons of empathy and solidarity with others who are like themselves. Again, individuals are less likely to be generous to ethnic and racial others, and this is particularly true, and this is very important, this is especially true if outgroups or others are disproportionately poor, if they're small enough in size, in numerical size, and if they tend to vote consistently with one political party, right? Such that the other political party can afford to alienate them over time without losing many votes, right? Of course, this can also be driven by animus, by racism, and it can be stoked by opportunistic politicians that seek to limit redistribution, right? So again, it's not necessarily a hard and fast relationship, but there is a general pattern that links inequality with ethnic fractionalization. So greater ethnic fractionalization here on as you move right along the x-axis, greater inequality as you move up on the y-axis. There's a positive relationship. That's also true of racial fractionalization. It's also true of linguistic fractionalization. Yet another separate argument is tied to war involvement. So why might war involvement be tied to greater equality? Well, major war involvement can impact citizens' sense of what is fair in terms of taxation. So in particular, if the poor and the middle classes are conscripted to fight at higher rates than the wealthy, then they may believe that it's only fair that the wealthy pay for their fair share, right, to fund the war. Even more so if the wealthy own businesses that might profit from the war, right? So there's this kind of implicit social contract, and the poor say, look, it's only fair if elites pay more, if they're being conscripted at lower rates. And there's data on this from World War I, World War II, data on taxation, and in particular, this is some work by Ken Sheevy and David Stasevich on inheritance tax rates. So the so-called death tax, right? So, taxes that are levied on estates, on wealth, at the time that an individual dies, right? And what you see with these data, these are data from the Netherlands and the UK, inheritance tax rates increased dramatically in the context of World War I and World War II, where individuals, especially poor and middle-income individuals, were conscripted at really high rates to go fight in those wars, right? It's not only limited to those countries. This is probably a little small and hard to see, but what you can see is that across a lot of OECD countries, for the most part, these patterns roughly play out, where countries conscripted individuals at a relatively high rate, inheritance taxes increased, and that persisted for a significant period of time. Okay. Yet another, the penultimate explanation for why some countries tend to be much more equal than other countries has to do with simply the workings of capitalism, right? And countries that are capitalistic versus countries that are not. So this gets into Thomas Piketty's work, and what Piketty calls the fundamental force for divergence. And so he has this expression R is greater than G, right? And where R is the average rate of return on capital and G is the growth rate of an economy. And that's a particularly important expression. It helps you understand why, in some ways, capitalism can be hardwired to encourage greater inequality when R is greater than G. In other words, when the rate of return on capital is greater than growth. So when you have slow growth in your economy, the role of inherited wealth in society outpaces that of income. And as a result, you get greater inequality. This is also tied to what Piketty calls the second law of capitalism, if you believe in laws of capitalism. This expression here is B equals S over G, where B is the capital income ratio, S is the savings rate, and G is the growth rate. And again, the implication here is somewhat parallel to the previous, to the one I talked about on the previous slide. When G is low, when the growth rate, economic growth is relatively low, capital becomes increasingly important relative to income. And that impacts social structures, and it impacts the distribution of wealth or inequality in society, right? Inherited wealth, again, starts the importance of inherited wealth outpaces that of income, and inequality rises. And so this is some data on the capital income ratio in several countries in Europe. And what you see here is that, capital income ratios were fairly stable and relatively high. Inequality was relatively high between sort of 1870, when Piketty has some of his earliest data, where data are available, and essentially World War I, right? World War I cuts off the top of the income income and wealth distribution, and countries become more equal. That those rates, the capital income ratio, further declines as wealth is destroyed in the context of the Great Depression. It's yet further destroyed in the context of World War II, and then there's some sort of policy lock-in that persists for a couple decades, but his laws of capitalism kick in, and you start to get this reversion to the mean, and you get an increase in inequality to where we see today rates of inequality are starting to rival that of what we saw on the eve of World War I in a number of countries in Europe. Again, this is a graph I showed earlier, simply rising capital income ratios. Okay. The last explanation here, and the one that I'm going to talk about a little bit more for the rest of the talk, is democracy and political regime type, right? So the argument here is that under dictatorship, authoritarian elites face not very much pressure to redistribute, and they seek to implement policies that benefit themselves. They are the relatively wealthy, so they implement policies that enrich themselves. And so over time, they become relatively unequal, right? Democracy, on the other hand, and this is, there's work on the so-called median voter theorem that argues that democracy empowers citizens. It empowers citizens through the vote, right? And because the wealth of a median voter is less than that of the mean, something I'll talk about in the next slide, there should be greater pressure for redistribution and as a result, greater equality over time, right? People should vote for policies that roughly converge on the preferences of the median voter, and because the median citizen in a society is not a particularly wealthy individual, there should be pressure for redistribution and as a result, greater equality. Furthermore, there's obviously that works through this voting mechanism, right? There's greater representation, there's greater accountability under democracy, and that should mechanically tie disparities in income to greater redistribution, and therefore reversion to a relatively equal status quo, or equilibrium, I should say. Again, why is that the case? As I mentioned on the previous slide, the median wealth in the society tends to be substantially below that of the mean wealth or income, and that's because the poor outnumber the rich, right? So this is simply data from this is data just from the United States, but this pattern is repeated across every country for which we have data, that there's simply a very large skew in the distribution of wealth amongst individuals. So this is data from the panel study of income dynamics, which is a long-standing panel study amongst American families that collects data on income and wealth. And this here is, along the y-axis is simply the number of families, and on the x-axis that have this corresponding amount of net wealth in tens of thousands of US dollars. What you can see is a lot of people have not that much net wealth compared to, the Warren Buffetts of the world, the Bezoses of the world, right? There are very few of them. Most everybody is somewhere around here, right? And as a result, the Buffetts and the Bezoses, they sort of pull out, they push to the right, mean income, mean wealth, and far from the median, and the median is somewhere around here, right? So everybody who's below median should be voting for policies that are redistributive, right? Again, that's the logic behind sort of the democracy and equality sort of theoretical argument, right? The data on this are, I think, a lot more mixed. So it turns out that if you look at the relationship between democracy and inequality, this is back to the map of the Gini coefficient, and here I have simply grayed out countries that were non-democratic, circa 2008 or 2009 here, and countries that are colored, countries that are democratic in that year. And what you see is that there are a lot of democracies that are relatively equal. There's a lot of democracies that are relatively unequal, right? So there's not a very strict relationship between these. It's also the case that if you look at a country's level of democracy, sort of how democratic is a country, from very non-democratic on the left here to very democratic on the right, what you see again is that there's basically no relationship between inequality and a country's level of democracy. It's also the case that countries, this is the level of inequality here on the y-axis, and this is simply cases of transition to democracy. And I believe since 1950 or since World War II here. And what you see is that countries have democratized, transitioned to democracy at all different levels of inequality, right? Some at relatively low levels of inequality, a number at relatively high levels of inequality. Okay, so now I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about why that's the case. Why is it that democracy is not inherently tied to greater equality? Why is it that it doesn't impact necessarily transitions to democracy, and that it may not even impact the distribution of wealth or income with a society after democratization? And I'm going to argue that that has a lot to do with who's empowered in the process of democratization itself and how democratization plays out. So before getting there, let me just give you just a couple quick and dirty details of a couple facts about democracy, right? So this is simply a graph of the rise of democracy in the world since 1800 up until relatively close to the present. And what you see is that democracy has really taken off, right? So these are the so-called three waves of democracy, if you will, right? 1, 2, 3 here, and this is the number of democracies that are in the world here on the y-axis. And so democracy has spread. Now about half the countries in the world are democratic. It's also the case that this is a graph here that shows the distribution of the population in the world living under different regime types, right? What proportion of individuals in the world live under democracy versus under dictatorship? Because we know that there's some very big dictatorships out there, right? China, for example. There are some big democracies as well, India. So this is, the percentage of the world's population living in democracy over time versus in other regimes, and it's a relatively similar pattern to what we saw previously, right? So over time, there's now slightly more than half of the world, for the first time in world history, lives under democracy, right? But it's really only a bit over half. About practically half of the world lives under dictatorship still. All right, and so there's a lot of ways to get to democracy. And so I think to understand why it is that democracy doesn't translate into greater equality, you've got to understand what actors are involved in the transition to democracy and the different paths to democratization. And the long of the short of it is that democratic transitions can transpire in several different ways that empower different actors, and that has distributional consequences for what democracy looks like after transition. So, you might say in broad brushstroke that there are sort of four paths to democratic transition. The first is through popular mobilization, where citizens sort of overthrow a regime and institute a new one, institute a democracy. They overthrow a dictatorship, institute democracy. A second mode is a gradual and protracted transition to democracy. I'll talk about some of these examples of these as well. The third is when there are splits within an authoritarian regime, and some of the elites under dictatorship negotiate their way out the door in concert with, an opposition, maybe a moderate opposition, right? And the final is what you might call, and this is what I'll focus on a little bit, towards the end of the talk, is elite-driven democratizations, where authoritarian elites, for one reason or another, might see the writing on the wall in the future, and therefore they want to stage manage their way out the door, a transition to democracy in terms that are favorable to them. So there are examples of all of these historically, right? So transitions to democracy via popular mobilization certainly happened in Eastern Europe after the fall of the Iron Curtain. It happened in a number of countries in Africa in the 1990s and 2000s. Gradual and protracted transitions occurred in, the United Kingdom is a classic example of this. First, second, third Reform Acts in the context of the 19th century, right, that gradually extended the franchise, and the UK became more democratic, but in a very slow sort of fashion, right? Taiwan is another one that slowly opened up over time until it became democratic in 1996. There are Greece and Portugal in the 1970s are good examples of these negotiated transitions to democracy, where there were splits within the authoritarian regime, and some authoritarian elements negotiated their way into democracy. And countries like Spain, or transitions like Spain in 1977 and Chile in 1990 are examples of elite-driven transitions where elites stage managed the transition itself and what democracy would look like after. So again, these modes of transition and how democracy transpires or comes to be has a big implication for the distributive consequences of who gets what under democracy, right? So as you might be able to guess, in the cases of popular mobilization, where the masses are out on the streets, they're literally pulling down the regime, right? You ended up getting a lot more egalitarian forms of political and economic institutions in the aftermath. These are a couple examples of that, right, from Eastern Europe. in terms of, and so I think that's something that's sort of in the popular, it's easy to understand, right? And I think those are kind of a lot of the cases that we see sort of, in the popular media, the way a lot of people think about democratization. So the masses are out there in the streets, they pull down the regime, and you get this, you get a blank slate, right? You get a blank slate. And the new, citizens basically create a new social contract, and they create rules under which they will live. Those are favorable to them, right? As opposed to the former authoritarian elite. That's different from this process of gradual enfranchisement. Gradual enfranchisement was much more typical in sort of historically in Europe, right? Europe is a number of the canonical cases of this gradual enfranchisement, though, as I mentioned previously, not exclusively. There are other cases like Taiwan, right? But in these cases of transition to democracy, the franchise is broadened slowly over time, and governments become increasingly more responsive to citizen demands and more accountable to the majority of the population. Typically because it's the franchise is extended progressively, it tends to extend to poorer and poorer groups of citizens, right? So first it's the elites who have the right to vote. Then it's the upper middle class. Then it's the middle class. Then it's the poor. Historically, that's typically how it's happened. Not exclusively. There are some urban-rural dynamics in other cases as well, right? But that gradual enfranchisement and greater responsiveness can yield over time greater redistribution, greater egalitarianism, right? More spending on things like education, health, housing, and infrastructure, more progressive forms of taxation and inheritance, income, and other things, right? More of a social safety net over time. And so if you think about like Robert Dahl's work on democracy, what we're talking about here in terms of gradual enfranchisement is you go from these authoritarian systems to greater contestation, but contestation amongst the rich, right? You get these kind of competitive oligarchies like you had in the UK, right? First, and then later on, you get greater participation and gradual kind of enfranchisement as you move to democracy, right? So Europe, a number of Western Europe basically kind of follows that trajectory, right? The popular mobilization trajectory is that, all at once, right? But then there's another trajectory, right, is where you have greater participation over time, but you don't necessarily get degrees of contestation that are sort of commensurate with a broad distribution of rights within the population. And as a result, you get a lot of these transitions to democracy, and I would actually argue that, empirically, I think the data support this, that the majority of transitions to democracy are either negotiated transitions or they're driven by elites. This is a canonical example, right? South Africa, in which basically you have here on your left, you have de Klerk, the head of the apartheid regime, negotiating with Nelson Mandela, right, in the context of the transition to democracy in South Africa in 1994. I'll come back to that case a little bit later. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about this third type of path to democratization, which is this negotiated democratization. This typically occurs through splits within an authoritarian regime and splits amongst the opposition as well, right? So unlike the previous, certainly the view or the path of democracy where you move from dictatorship all of a sudden to these sorts of popular democracy through mass level, revolution and that sort of thing, masses going out in the streets and pulling down the regime, this negotiated form of democratization takes seriously the origins of democracy actually being in dictatorship, right? And the impacts that might have on what democracy ends up looking like. So, very few democracies, in fact, are constructed by representatives of the majority during a movement from below that's dedicated to political change through these sort of popular mass action, right? Typically, they're constructed, at least in part, by elites of the former authoritarian regime. And that can occur when there are sort of splits within the incumbent authoritarian regime and splits within an opposition, an opposition to that regime. We might call it a democratic opposition, right? So inside the regime, you have a set of individuals who say, no, we're not opening up. These are hardliners. They say, we're just going to crack down. What we need to do here is repress and try and hold on, right, and hang on to dictatorship. And then you have a set of reformers who say, that may not hold up over time, that may not work over time. Maybe what we should do is, in fact, reach out to a set of moderate opposition and try and construct some sort of negotiated transition that isn't so bad for us and is still, it gives something to the opposition, to the moderate opposition, such that they're also willing to strike a deal, right? In order for that to really work out, there's got to be an understanding between those who want to open up the authoritarian regime, the reformers within the regime, and this moderate opposition, right? So the moderates in the opposition have to sideline more radical elements of the opposition so that in order to coax effectively the reformers out of power, right? So the reformers who are opening up within an authoritarian regime might be worried, right? They might say, look, if I try and strike a deal with the opposition, with moderates in the opposition, and then I hand over the vote, I step out of power, I hand over the vote, why isn't it going to be the case that they're simply going to renege on the bargain, change the terms of the deal? They're going to come and they're going to prosecute me. They're going to throw me in jail, right? They're going to create new policies, new laws that are inimical to my interests. And so as a result, in order for a deal to be credible for the reformers of an authoritarian regime who are looking to head to the exits, moderates have to provide some way to credibly commit to controlling radicals, right? And to making sure that they're not simply going to rip up a deal. Okay, so that's another sort of way in which you can get to democracy, right? And that has some parallels in some ways to what I call elite-driven democratization. But elite-driven democratization, I think, is also different in key ways from negotiated democratization. So again, this path or this conception of a transition to democracy takes seriously that the origins of democracy, again, are in dictatorship frequently, right? And through elite-driven democratization, what happens is that outgoing authoritarian elites purposefully and explicitly design rules and institutions on their terms in a way that blocks the ability of voters under democracy to translate their preferences into public policy. So again, this does not have to happen through an internal reformist coalition of softliners, if you will, or some set of elites within an authoritarian regime that wants to open up and sort of reform their ways, or that they will negotiate even with the opposition, right? There are many cases in which democracy is effectively imposed from above. Elites are the ones who lead a transition to democracy, and in fact, they design democracy. So what I've found in some of my work is that about 2/3 of new countries that have become democratic since 1800 have done so under constitutions that they themselves that are designed by the outgoing authoritarian regime, right? So in other words, in 2/3 of democratic transitions, an authoritarian regime writes a constitutional framework. They then push that constitutional framework onto a new democracy, and the new democracy lives under that constitution, oftentimes for a significant period of time. There are a lot of cases, right? Chile is a good case of this, Indonesia, Turkey, South Africa, Thailand. 2/3 of new democracies, in fact, have this experience, right? However, that's not the entire universe of transition to democracy, right? There are still these other cases, some of which fit into the patterns that I mentioned previously. Things like, democratization via revolution or through mass political action, right? So about 1/3 of countries that have transitioned to democracy since 1800 have done so, without these authoritarian constitutions. So there's been a transition to democracy, and then upon democratization, voters basically convoke a constituent assembly, they create a new social contract, and that new social contract tends to be much more representative of their preferences. And as a result, they're much more effective at translating those preferences into policy. Examples of this are Argentina's transition in 1983, Greece in 1974, the Philippines in 1986, and Mongolia in 1990. But again, that's somewhat exceptional, right? So if you look at transitions to democracy by constitutional origins, again, 2/3 have transitioned with authoritarian constitutions. This is a little bit hard to see, but those, the parts of these bars that are grayed are cases of transitions under authoritarian constitutions. And for those of you who can't quite see it, what this graph shows is that there's been a relatively consistent trend over time. In other words, it's not the case that, say, 150 years ago, countries were transitioning with authoritarian penned constitutions, and that never happens anymore. That's not the case. In fact, since World War II, 2/3 of democracies, in fact, closer to 70% of new democracies have been instituted with authoritarian constitutions. So this is not something that's old or relegated to the past. And if we look at democracies that continue to operate under authoritarian constitutions, what we see is that since 1900, about 1/3 of the world's democracies are operating under authoritarian constitutions. Of course, some scrap these constitutions over time, which is why there's a disparity between the fact that 2/3 of countries that have transitioned have done so with authoritarian constitutions and the fact that only 1/3 are operating with them, right? So some scrap these constitutions, some after a couple years, but much more typically after a long period of time, after decades or more in some cases. Sweden is an interesting example, right? Sweden transitions to democracy 1909, 1911, depending on how you want to count it. They operate under a constitution that was written in the 1800s, and they do so until 1974. All right. This is simply shows over time. Again, we've got in the solid line here the number of democracies in the world over time, and the dashed line is the number of democracies operating under authoritarian constitutions. And what you see is that trend has been growing in a parallel fashion. But again, some democracies with these authoritarian constitutions sort of drop off the map, and they write their own social contracts, right? All right. So who are the important players in this elite-driven democratization? How do we kind of understand, now that we have some sense that this is actually a pretty common phenomena, how do we understand the distributive consequences, right? Why it matters for things like inequality. And to understand that, I think we've got to understand who some of the key players here are in elite-driven democratization. So I would put them into 4 different categories, right? So you have incumbent authoritarian political elites, and you have incumbent economic elites, those who are, favored economic sectors that are allied with the regime, whose profits and rents and things like that are directly tied to being cozy with authoritarian political elites. Then you have a set of outsider economic elites, those who are relatively wealthy in society and whose earnings, profits do not necessarily depend on political elites and the whims of political elites. And then you have citizens. And so why, in some cases, would incumbent authoritarian political elites and economic elites actually seek democratization, right? Why would they drive the process of democratization and want to ever live under democracy, right? Well, one of the reasons is because dictatorship is in fact a dangerous game, right? So, when things are going well for you under dictatorship, and you're allied to the regime or you're a member of the regime, things are going very well for you, right? But when things are not going well for you, they can go very, very poorly, right? You can be arbitrarily jailed, killed, expropriated, et cetera, and you have very little recourse under dictatorship. Democracy, that's much less frequently the case, right? Because of institutional constraints and checks and balances in democracy, the downside risk is much less under democracy. And so elites sometimes see democracy as a safer long-term bet for their interests when they're worried about something happening to them under dictatorship. So again, it's not just driven by ideological divisions within a regime, hardliners, softliners, this kind of stuff. Sometimes it's driven by their calculations about what they're likely to draw under dictatorship versus democracy in the future. When would they actually seek democracy? What's the straw that breaks the camel's back, if you will, right? When do they decide to push for a democratic transition? In the book, and I think a couple chapters that were circulated, we argue that it has to do with the rise of outsider economic elites that threaten to topple incumbents within the authoritarian regime. And it threatens to topple incumbent political elites, authoritarian political elites, and their economic allies who are favored under dictatorship, right? And so there are two factors then that ultimately encourage elite-led democratization. There's a set of proximate factors that strengthen outsider economic elites, could be crises, et cetera, that give them an upper hand in a temporary fashion, right? Vis-a-vis incumbent economic and political elites. And then there has to be some sort of structural underpinnings, if you will, that enable political elites, incumbent political and economic elites, to coordinate on a better solution. In other words, to stage manage a transition to democracy, to create an institutional architecture that will favor them over the longer term, right? If they don't have the capacity to do that, to gather all together in a room, right, close the doors, figure out what's going to benefit them over the long term, then it's very difficult to construct a transition to democracy that will favor them over the long term. But if they can do that, and if they're worried about the rise of these outsider economic elites, potentially toppling them in the future, then they have incentive to get together in that room and to create an architecture, an institutional architecture that will favor them over time. And one way to do that is through constitutions. That's a critical tool that they can use to lock in their power over time. So, why are constitutions potentially a very useful tool in that regard, right? Someone say, Constitution, nothing but a piece of paper, right? Why does it matter? But constitutions are formal political institutions, and so they aggregate conflicting interests into public policy outcomes, right? They give political weight to specific groups in society, and that depends on stipulations within the Constitution and associated legal institutions. They give groups different tools and opportunities to get their way. That might happen through elections, right, at different levels of government, for example. And these institutions generate incentives for politicians to respond to specific groups' preferences within societies. So, in other words, these formal political institutions matter, right? And so constitutions, on the one hand, they can sort of seek to establish kind of efficient institutions, efficient forms of government. They might establish sort of justice and fairness. I mean, we think about these as things that are associated with constitutionalism and constitutional drafting, right? But they can also reflect the powerful imposing their preferences upon the relatively weak. And I should pause just for a minute. So when time did we start?
Yeah, so
Have I been?
running out of time. But
Yeah, okay, good. So let me, so I'll wrap this up then in the next 5 minutes, right? So, there's that particular view of constitutionalism, and I suppose some of that is in fact, that notion is sort of imbued in our view of the U.S. Constitution. But of course, there's a lot of elements of the U.S. Constitution and other constitutions that in fact reflect, the ability of the powerful to implement or to get their way, right, over the relatively weak. And there's a lot of ways in which the powerful can do that, right? So there's a lot of, I suppose, handles within the constitution-making process that enable them to manipulate the process to their advantage, right? So that has to do with things like the election or appointment of a constitutional assembly. They can pack an assembly with their allies or with themselves. And within the second stage of creating drafting and voting rules, they can manipulate those rules within a constituent assembly in ways that favor them. And finally, they can create rules for determining future outcomes in ways that, again, favor them, right? Adopting voting procedures that favor them and things like that. So there's examples of this from the United States. And let me talk for a little bit about what these actually look like in most circumstances of transitions to democracy. So you've got things like vote aggregation rules, so electoral system design, malapportionment, gerrymandering, indirect elections. Those are all things that can be embedded within constitutions to favor those who drafted, right? Military integrity, things like having military vetoes over specific policies, the appointment of military senators, parallel judiciary organizations or judicial organizations for the military, selective party bans, ways specifically to attack the opposition, restrictions on the franchise that are selective. There are ways to protect former authoritarian elites from prosecution, prohibitions on ex post punishment, for example, And then you can safeguard your assets, right? You can try and protect the status quo by making private property rights sacrosanct, making that difficult to change. And then you can create supermajority thresholds for change over time. So if an outgoing authoritarian regime embeds many of these elements into a constitution, they can tie it up with a bow and make it very, very difficult to change over time, right? And I think let me just say one more word, but there's a host of examples that I could talk about from all over the world, really. And the upshot of all this is that there are real consequences for inequality, right? So there's an association, a strong association between democracy and greater equality and more egalitarian political and economic outcomes, but only if elites are unable to impose a constitutional architecture on a new democracy before they exit power. So in that third of cases where, where the masses or the citizens organize and oust the regime, create a new social contract, there's a great association between democracy and equality. But in most of the world where that doesn't hold, there is not a relationship at all between regime type and democracy and inequality on the other hand, right? And so that holds across the host of different measures of democratic governance and of fiscal, monetary, and material outcomes. So no matter how you look at taxation and social spending, countries that inherit this authoritarian sort of institutional overhang are much less likely to engage in redistributive politics and tend to be much more unequal over time. And so, so that helps to explain this relationship right here. So for that, I'll leave it there for now, and we can talk more about some of these issues in the Q&A.
Great.
Mm-hmm.